Good morning and good afternoon, and thank you for joining APQC's Process and Performance webinar, Tactical and Practical Tips for Surviving the 6 Change Reactions. A few housekeeping items before we begin. We will be live tweeting today's webinar, so you can join the conversation by following hashtag #PPNAPQC. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them using the question tab on the right side of your screen. Questions will be answered at the end of today's presentation. And today's webinar is being recorded. You will receive a copy of the slides and a recording within the next few days. Excuse me. And now I'd like to take a moment to introduce today's moderator, Holly Hoagland. Holly is the Process and Performance Management Principal Research Lead here at APQC with over 10 years of business research and consulting experience. Holly has extensive experience in both quantitative and qualitative research and has developed the methodology for several best practice benchmarking consulting projects in open innovation, resource management, sustainability, and voice of customer. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to you, Holly.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank everybody for joining us today. It is actually my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, the engaging, educating, and always entertaining Hayden Shaw. Hayden is an author, speaker, trainer, and consultant. He's researched and helped clients regarding change management, as well as regarding generational differences for over the last 20 years. He's the author of Sticking Points, How to Get 4 Generations Working Together, and the 12 Places They Come Apart, and Franklin Covey's best-selling workshops, Leading Across Generations and Working Across Generations. Furthermore, he's also been hailed as the leadership guru by the Washington Post. So without any further ado, I would like to hand this over to Hayden.
Good morning. Let's go into deeper detail on how do you actually apply the 6 change reactions. So if you and I had been together, what month was it? See, I'm old now. October. It was of October when we were there at the conference and there at the Houstonian. If we were together there, we spent an hour on this, and so now we're going to go into greater detail. But just in case you weren't there, or you're like, hey, that was a long time ago, I don't remember all the details of it, let's spend the first couple of minutes understanding the 6 change reactions. Then we'll go into some greater depth on how do you lead through each of the 6 change reactions, okay? And we're going to focus specifically on this wave with accelerate momentum and disperse resistance. Won't have time to get into the other 3 components. That's part of kind of a one-day training program. But let's look at the key or the core of it, accelerating momentum and dispersing resistance, the 2 key things in getting the change wave to work. All right. So with that said, let's start with understanding, because it's not the change, it's the wave. It's not the change itself, it's the emotions that get us. So the change happens, and 6 months later, people are still emotionally processing or stuck with the change, and leaders of the change are thinking, this is crazy. I don't know what's wrong with people. How can they be so resistant? They are just against good ideas. No matter what kind of process work you're doing, sustainability work, no matter what kind of work you're doing, you're thinking, dealing with all these difficult and sometimes downright stubborn people. Well, that's because it's not the change itself. It's the wave. It's not the logic of it all. It's the emotion. It comes from asking people to do things differently, and our neural pathways get dug in really deep, even after a couple of years of doing something the same way. So, since it's the emotion that so impacts change, as I had said in October, it's not the earthquake that kills so many people, it's the tsunami, it's the wave. Since that's the case, how do we deal with the emotions of change? And so, with that said, there are 6 different reactions people have to change, spread out over a bell curve. And the first is only 5% of the population, but they are widely and wildly in love with change. They even love change for change's sake. Whereas their counterpart on this bell curve are, and by the way, for all those of you who are statisticians, I want to officially recognize that these are not accurate numbers. In a bell curve, there are decimal points. I rounded for the sake of convenience. I have to say that our mathematical folks can sometimes be bothered for up to 30 minutes by the lack of decimals. So 5%, their counterparts are equally as passionate about change, but they are passionately resistant to it. Okay, and then 15% of people are fans of change, and 15% of people are not. And then the vast majority of people just sit on the fence of change, and a very small percent, it's a subset of that negative 5%. They are just super negative toward change, and then their own little species, okay? Own little reaction to change. These folks who are wildly positive toward change and often like change for change's sake, these folks are best driven by emotion. That's their orientation. They're emotional about change, and that's why I call them enthusiasts. Whereas the next group likes change, but they're thoughtful about change, and so we call them progressives. Despite the fact that it's a political word now, progressives versus conservatives, I simply mean they are looking to progress. They would rather have the risks of the future than the limitations of the past. And they're thoughtful about the problems that these movements forward would solve, rather than being emotionally excited about whatever happens in the next change. On the other hand, the counterparts of the progressives are the preservationists. They are more concerned about what we're going to give up by moving into the future than they are about the limitations of our current reality. They are very concerned that we preserve all of the gains that happened in the past, all of the good things that happened in the past. And, sometimes, occasionally I get asked, what's the difference between that and being a conservative? Well, a preservationist is worried about losing what's been gained in the past rather than grabbing onto the possibilities of the future. In many ways, they're a bird in the hand, beats two in the bush kind of folks. And so the counterpart of the enthusiasts, they're people who are resistors, and they don't like change, and they don't like change emotionally. And as I quipped back then, they really do relate to green eggs and ham. I do not like change on a boat. I do not like change with a goat. They just don't like it. And for them, it is an emotional thing. It often has physical, emotional reactions. I have a family member in my extended family who just literally gets physically sick. And it's gross if any of you are eating lunch, but he gets diarrhea when he goes through major life changes. Just emotionally, physically get sick over it. And sorry for those of you who might be eating here where it's in the central region at lunchtime. All right, fence setters. The vast majority of people, they're on the fence. They wait it out. I don't have a strong opinion on this. Let's just see what happens. And that's where the real challenge in change comes, is not so much the resistors, not so much the preservationists, but the folks on the fence, because that's the majority of people you have to move if you're going to move change forward. And then lastly, there are the light eaters. They eat light. They are emotionally, they suck the light out of all good change in every organization. And so they're a unique group. They're especially loud, but unique. Now, the enthusiasts give us liftoff. What do they contribute to the change process? We need them because their enthusiasm gets changes going. Without them, it's hard to get, just like without the fuselage on the space shuttle, it's hard to get that bulking, heavy object into space. It takes a lot of fuel to get it going, and then they burn out. They give us a liftoff. What the progressives give us is influence. I call them the salespeople of every change process. And we'll see why the leaders can initiate change. The leaders can give credibility to change, but leaders don't sell change. Now, many people say, hey, you have got to have leaders involved or change programs don't work. And I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm also adding to it that while leaders can initiate and give credibility to the change process, leaders can stop it if they're not for it, if they don't get behind it. The real work of change happens among the people who are actually implementing it, and that's why the progressives are the most leveraged group of people, because the progressives determine whether or not it's going to happen, because they influence or they sell the fence sitters who move it all forward. What do the fence sitters give us? The fence sitters give us the possibility of tipping. Change doesn't happen when everyone jumps on board. And anybody who's been working with change knows it's naive to expect everyone on board. Change happens when enough people get on board for that to be the new normal, at least for a group of people, and then results to begin to appear. In order to get results to appear, you've got to, and when results appear, it tips, and it begins to pull other fence sitters who are on the more negative half forward, and that's what gives you that positive momentum. So the folks on the right-hand side are pulling the momentum toward the change. The folks on the left-hand side are resisting the change, holding back the change, and what we're really looking for is to tip the momentum so the obviously helpful and powerful aspects of the change, the results of the change, sway the momentum, switch the momentum. That's really the trick in all of this, is letting the natural goodness, letting the power of the change actually carry itself forward and pull people with it, rather than trying to get everybody on the negative side on board first, which is a fool's errand anyway. So the secret of change is getting it to tip, and the secret of tipping is getting most of the positive fence sitters to move forward by embracing the change and demonstrating results. Okay? Then preservationists give us flaws. Preservationists can see what goes wrong in the plan, and that's amazingly helpful. And then finally, the resistors, they give us distraction. The resistors, they're just distracting. There's not a positive benefit to them. They're distracting. The fence sitters, on the other hand, they're dangerous, because they not only resist the change, they try to undercut the people who are leading the change. They try to undercut the progressives and the enthusiasts, and they try to trash anyone who of the fence sitters who moves forward, because they just don't like change, they don't like people, they like power, or they like griping. And so they are disproportionately loud, even though 1% is often high. Many organizations have a fraction of 1%, with very healthy cultures. The worst cultures I've ever seen, where as the saying goes, the inmates have been running the asylum. In those situations, it's not more than 1.5% light eaters. But even then, they are everywhere because they're loud. And so we'll talk about, what do you do with these 6 change reactions? So our poll is limited to 5 responses, and so we're going to have you pick the predominant responses rather than the light eaters, because it's a subcategory. Which of the 6 change reactions is causing the most complications for your current change program? Think about the one that you've got most on your mind. Go ahead and vote.
We've got about 30% of the attendees have voted so far, so we'll give it a few more seconds so we can get a majority of the folks answered. Okay, we're at 76%, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results.
Thank you. That makes sense. I'm just looking at it here. So fence setters, for 35% of you, getting people on the fence to move is the big issue. And understandably, for 46% of you, the folks that just are constantly seeing flaws in everything that's done. And we'll give you some great ideas for the 15% of you who are dealing with resistors on how to burp them and send them back to work. And of course, light eaters are their own category. We'll talk about those later. All right, great. Would you please close that out? And let's get after the second part, which is leading through the 6 change reactions. So our key goal, as I already mentioned, is to accelerate momentum, to take the forces within our teams and organization that are pushing forward for the change that we're working so hard for in our roles, to get people doing better equality, to get a greater process focus in the organization, to get people to comply with processes, to not only value stream that, but to actually get the value out of the streaming. And so all of those things that you're working on in your roles as influencers and as leaders, often leaders that don't have direct authority over making people do things, being able to be a person that can accelerate the momentum that is already at work, and then using fit setters to help tip that momentum over becomes critical to the work you do in dealing with the emotions of change and then just succeeding at your job. So let's take a look at each of these in more detail. Now, in the workshop itself, we have cards that go into greater detail than we have time for here. What I've done is kind of pick the high points, the key characteristics, and then a couple of key things of what to do about it. So characteristics: enthusiasts love whatever's new. They love new stuff. They dismiss the challenges that the preservationists bring up as details that'll be worked out and the price of progress. And so they roll their eyes when fit setters, the more negative fit setters, are like, I don't know until I see a clear plan. I actually was working with one of these folks just this week. I was looking for I was looking to buy a service myself, and I wanted to have some specific answers to some questions, and the person said, you just need to buy it, and then we'll work those details out. That's a higher level of trust than I have in you before I spend my hard-earned money. And I think that person lost my business because they talk like an enthusiast. Quickly lose interest in change teams. That's the challenge with these folks. They're really hot on the idea at first, and then because they're emotionally driven in their orientation, they burn out quickly, like the fuselage on the space shuttle. Well, what do you do with enthusiasts? Now, no one selected them as having them be the challenge, and they're often not. The only time enthusiasts become the challenge is when they try to sidetrack the group. When you've got a pretty clear, narrow scope, and they keep wanting to add to the scope. They want to creep up, and they're often a major cause of scope creep. So if you're running into that, it might be because of the enthusiasts. Quit expecting stability from them. Let them drop off the team. The other time enthusiasts can cause you problems is when you want to keep them on the team. They signed up for the team, by golly, it'll look like people are bailing like rats off a sinking ship if they leave. If we have 2 enthusiasts leave, no, we don't want the fuselage pulling down the space shuttle once all the fuel's gone. Thank you for helping us rock it and get this thing lifted off. And now please go find something else to do. You either people with ADHD or ADHD-like characteristics. Please go to work. Quit complaining about them when their enthusiasm wanes. That's the counterpart to that. If you quit expecting stability, you will quit complaining, because other people on the team will see them as flaky when actually they're essential in the initial stages of most change rollouts. And then don't let them distract the team if they insist on saying. Some of them are fairly powerful, either because of the position they're in as a supervisor or a manager, or they're powerful because they've been around the place for a while and have some people who see them as a innovation champion, especially with innovation being so high on CEOs' lists. From the Compass Board research, kind of the last 3 years, innovation is one of the top 3 to 5 topics, depending on the survey and the year. They can have additional influence or authority or power because of that. And so don't let them distract the team if they insist on staying. Just keep redirecting and saying, hey, that's a great idea, but that is not our purpose or our focus here. And eventually they'll get frustrated, and usually they just quit coming to meetings. Progressives. the high leverage folks to make change happen? Well, their characteristics. They're comfortable with not having every question answered. They're thoughtful. They see the problems. They're excited that this might be an answer to those problems, or at least we're addressing those problems, but they're comfortable with not having every question answered. They believe what they hear when leaders give well thought out reasons. They believe leaders. They can hear leaders. And leaders give a well thought out reason, and they're with it. And they're the core of the innovation or change teams. They're your core group. Why? Because they're your salespeople. You train them as salespeople. What do I mean by that? When people go to lunch, when they're chatting at their cubes, when they're hanging out before a meeting, and they're chatting about stuff, the people on the fence are going to bring up questions. The preservationists are going to bring up issues with the change and how it's being implemented. And your progressives are the folks that can actually answer those questions. Here's why. The folks on the negative spectrum are management deaf. They don't believe that managers understand the realities we're dealing with, and therefore managers, leaders, they don't get change. I call them management deaf. And they'll say, yeah, you know, whatever, that sounds great in theory, but the people who have to implement it don't get it. Just yesterday, I was working with a group of folks who were trying to adjust to generational differences. Getting staffing is the hardest issue, the biggest issue in their entire industry. And the vast majority of the workforce they hire from are millennials, and they're struggling. And one of the older people I was talking to was basically saying, you know, our leaders don't get it. They don't get what we're up against. Well, the leaders get it a lot more than she thinks they do. It's just she wants to go back to a past era when they could spend a lot more money, and frankly, they were in the red. She wanted to go back to that era when the demands weren't as high because they weren't in the black. And she wanted to go back to that. It wasn't realistic, but she was actually believing that the leaders didn't get it. And what the leaders believe is that she doesn't get it. And so, point is, she's a great person. She just doesn't believe leaders. She's management deaf. The more managers explain it, the more resistant she becomes. And I could see it before my eyes yesterday because the CEO was saying, oh, it's so great that we're in the black, and here's what we're going to have to do to stay there. And she saw that as, you don't understand the pressure we're under, and if you truly cared, you would release the pressure even if we couldn't stay in the black. So she was management deaf to that. Progressives are actually one of the troops, one of the associates, one of the staff. And if you train them to answer the questions that people ask, then that's what makes change tip. This is so critical because change actually happens when fence setters talk to progressives and fence setters bring up the questions they're hearing from the preservationists, the more negative folks, and then the progressives can answer the questions that the fence setters are asking. Now notice, I didn't say the progressives could answer the questions that the preservationists are asking, because if you go back to that chart, and you're going to get the slides for this, if you go back to that chart, only the people who are touching each other really can hear each other. Preservationists and progressives, they're too far apart in the way they approach the world to be able to really convince each other. Progressives think the preservationists will never be satisfied no matter how many reasons you give them, and preservationists believe that progressives are too hopeful and irrational. So the two of them are never going to click really well. They're not going to persuade each other. So that's why the progressives are the salespeople for the fence sitters. But the fence sitters are in the middle, and they've got all these preservationists raising questions to them that they can't answer. So they bring them to the progressives, and the progressives answer them. They go, see, that's a good answer. And they're in the middle. That's why they're fence sitters, and they're in the middle getting tossed back and forth between those two groups. If you'll train them to answer the questions that the preservationists are raising, the fence sitters will believe them, and the fence sitters will get on board. That sales training usually takes 3 or more conversations. What I mean by that is, progressive is at lunch. A fence setter says, well, I've heard this and this and this. Oh, I've heard that these new process redesigns end up eliminating 7% of all jobs. So we value stream map our way right out of existence. We come in, we bring in people who do a study on our processes, and they figure out more ways to get more done with fewer people. And the progressive goes, well, you know, that's not what the VP said when he announced this change. And they're like, yeah, well, that's usually what happens. And I was talking to Jim, and Jim's looked it up online, and that is standard numbers on how process redesign eliminates jobs. Well, this progressive, you know, you go chat with the progressive and say, hey, what are you hearing? Well, I'm hearing that this is going to eliminate jobs. Well, sometimes it does, but usually it's not what happens. We can deploy resources in other areas. How long have we been talking about if only we could get more resources, we could work on this and this? Yeah, that's the plan. Oh, so the progressive goes back to lunch sees the fit center they were talking to, you know, at lunch 2 days later, and they say, hey, I was talking with Hayden, and Hayden said that, yep, that's a good point, and here's our plan if there is any job dislocation. Because we've got opportunities if we can just get resources on it. So they're promising? He didn't promise. He's saying that's the plan. And so it goes back to another round. Well, you know, I think they need to promise us that there are not going to be any layoffs after these processes are established. And so a week and a half later, I run into this, since I'm using myself in the example, as management or as the change leader. I run into a progressive and I say, hey, what are you hearing? Well, people are saying that there ought to be a guarantee nobody's going to lose their jobs. Well, you know, you can't make a guarantee like that. Who knows what the market's going to do? But you can tell them that here's the plan. We're not anticipating that. And I know 4 years ago, we did a new process and we told people weren't going to lose their jobs. And then when we hit a market downturn, we did eliminate about 15 jobs, and people associate that with the process redesign. I get that. That's market downturn. If we redesign the process and we deploy those resources in other places, and then we hit a market downturn, I have no doubt that you and I may be up for downsizing. That's the nature of the beast. In other words, I'm giving you a long and detailed example because I want you to see how how you train these progressives by checking in with them, by finding out what they're hearing and what questions they don't know how to answer, and then giving them the answers to those questions that they just bring back to. This is the actual leavening process, just like yeast gets leavened through bread as you're kneading it. The same thing happens here. You are literally kneading the change process as it goes along. All right. So plan how you'll learn what they're hearing from the fence sitters and give them the facts, and it takes at least 3 times. Maybe in a long process change, it'll take 7 or 8 or 17 or 70 times where you check in and keep feeding them the answers to their questions so they can sell it, so they can influence. All right. I spent the most time on this one that we're going to spend because, as you can see, this is where the action actually happens. Okay? What about fit sitters? They're neutral about change. And as I admitted in October, I'm a fit sitter. At 54, I'm a fit sitter about a lot of changes. I've seen a lot of things. I've seen a lot of changes not work. I don't jump up and down and get real excited about stuff until I see the lights of their eyes. Believe what they see, not what they hear. They believe what they see, not what they hear. That's huge. Progressives and enthusiasts believe what they hear. Fit sitters have to see it to believe it. So the fastest way to make change happen is to have smaller projects rather than huge installations that allow us to show results and say, how's them apples? And then lastly, the positive half will jump on board when they see the initial results. If you don't have initial results, you're in trouble. That's similar to the conversation I was having with this guy when I was shopping around to buy the service. It was, well, who have you worked with, and what results have they got? Well, you know, once you see my process, I'm not writing you a check until I'm on the fence on this. I'm not writing you a check until you answer my questions. And maybe this person will do that. Maybe that's just their sales style. But fit sitters don't jump on board until they see initial results or have proof that it's worked someplace else, where they can see it to believe it. They got to have photos. All right, what do you do with them? Well, talk less until you can show initial results. If you're a change leader or in management, I know some of you are not in management, but you're also assigned to lead changes. Quit talking. Quit trying to talk fence sitters into seeing it, because what they're thinking to themselves is, well, that's because you're paid to say this. It's your job to make this happen. I don't know that this is best for me or the organization. And notice the order I said that in. I don't know that this is best for me or the organization. Train your salespeople, the progressives, to respond to the questions from the positive half. I know I have beat that horse dead, but that is what makes it happen. And then listen for what the negative half is hearing from the preservationists and address it in your plan. The fence setters on the negative half, remember it's such a large group that the tipping point line divides them in half, the negative half of the fence setters, those folks are sitting at lunch more regularly with preservationists. Find out what kinds of things the preservationists are saying and build it into your plan so that as you explain your plan to people, it's built right in. The objections have already been addressed in the plan. That gives the kind of reinforcements to the progressives that says, look, we got you. We got your back here. You can go out there and confidently know that we're hearing the legitimate questions people are raising and we're addressing them. And we're addressing the questions and the legitimate points they're making, the things that really will create a failure path, we're addressing in the plan itself. So we are listening to everyone. Then I love this quotation. A committee is a cul-de-sac down which ideas are lured and then quietly strangled. What you cannot do is have negative and positive people on the same change team and have it get any speed. It's just hard to get momentum for the change because it's critical to disperse the resistance. You're going to have resistance, but if we can disperse it, spread it out, thin it out, then we've got a much better chance at results. So, preservationists, how do we use them for what they're strong at and disperse the resistance that they create? They're thoughtfully uncomfortable with change. Just like progressives are comfortable with change, these folks are thoughtful, but they're uncomfortable with it. Can't think of 3 more reasons it won't work. No matter how many reasons you give them, they can think of 3 more. This is why preservationists are dangerous on change teams. We come up with an idea, we're like, yeah, let's go to work on that. Preservationists come back to the next meeting with 5 PowerPoints giving explanation of why this won't work. They've got 3 more reasons, and they've done the research on 5 more PowerPoints to prove why it won't work. And they just slowly strangle the change enthusiasm by always poking holes in things. I was working with one client, and he said, my boss doesn't like me. I said, no, she doesn't. He said, oh, you know that? I said, yes, she said that. He goes, I don't know what to do. I said, I can tell you exactly what to do. She's an idea person. She was half enthusiast and half progressive. I said, and every time she tosses out a new idea, it's like a balloon. And then you shoot it full of holes, and then the balloon falls to the ground, and you don't let her have a moment to let the balloon fly. You can come back to her later and say, I wonder about this and this, and she'll join you in thinking it through. But if she's excited about an idea and your first thing is to shoot it down, you've got to stop, or you have to get off the executive team, because you'll work your way right out of a job with that kind of leader. Because he could always think of 3 more reasons it wouldn't work until he just sucked the life right out of his boss, the owner of that organization. They have history on their side. They point out changes that did not work in the past. Here's why these folks are most dangerous. They're thoughtful, and they can always come up with ideas for why it's not going to work. And history is hard to refute. Back in 78, we tried something like that, and then we did another process improvement in 89, and then in 2004, none of them gave the results that were promised. And so, well, how do you argue with that? Hope for the future is easily shot down by proof from the past, because seeing is believing, and all the preservationists see are all the times it went wrong. And so help them emotionally by simply not getting stuck in the past and not having them on your change teams. Let them come in as consultants and point out the bad ideas, but don't have them there. The value their analytical skills. They see them as a gift, so accept them as a gift. Value their analytical skills. Often, change-oriented people, even people who work in, who are members of your organization, often, even if they're analytical, they see the analytical people who are resisting the change as a problem. I don't know what's wrong with them. They believe their analytical skills to point out the flaws in things is one of their most important gifts or skills. They see pointing out flaws as a gift. So take them on face value that this is a gift, and then cycle them. Be clear about their role as consultants rather than team members. And whatever you do, don't let people volunteer to be on the team, or I've literally watched negative people look at each other and decide who's going to sign up so they can kill the idea. Pick the people for the team and assign them roles. Don't let people volunteer. Or you're going to get too many preservationists or resistors or even light eaters on it who are trying to kill it. And then address their biggest objections in your plan. We've already said that, but it bears repeating. The preservationists are going to bring you 25 reasons why this won't work when they come in and consult. Only about 7 or 8 of them are legitimately high risk enough to build into your plan. Build those into your plan. Thank them for all of them, but build the ones in the plan that are legitimate issues. And as I said in October, literally, the change projects that go off the rails. Because the worst thing at all that can happen for your organization is if your change project works and then fails. If it gets implemented quickly because it has a lot of momentum and then it doesn't work, that's the worst thing that can happen. It's bad for the organization and it's bad for the credibility of everybody involved in it. It makes the next 3 change programs that much harder. The best thing that can happen is that it doesn't get implemented until we've got the details worked out and it actually works. So these people are helpful because preservationists have almost always pointed out the things that killed the failure paths that killed the change, that made it fail. Problem is they give us 25 things and most of them didn't kill it. But embedded in there are the great things that did. All right. Resistors, characteristics, they're emotional. So even when they see it, they're not sure they'll like it. They process their emotions out loud. So when they go through change, they talk about it. I don't like this. I don't know about this. And my joke is always, I've been looking at the paperclip inventory and we are desperately low. I don't know what we're gonna do. And they're not logical about it. They're emotional about it. And so team members may isolate them if they get too irritating. They're usually not on change teams because they usually don't volunteer for them. Or the other members of the team are like, oh no, and they kind of nudge them out of the team. But when they work with the other people in their department, they can be like, I don't know. Until people are like, give us some legitimate, logical reasons or hush up. And so they get isolated because they get too irritating. On the other hand, resistors, what do you do with them? Care about them, but don't let them get inside your head. I've seen bosses go, I don't know, I just feel like they're people who aren't on board yet. Yeah, they're not on board yet. They're never going to be on board. They hate change. Have you not read Dr. Seuss? They will not eat them until they are literally forced in their mouth in the last page of the book, and then they go, oh, this wasn't so bad, because they're not bad people. They're very motivated. They often are very loyal. They just don't like change. So burp them and then redirect them back to work. I wish we could spend an hour on this, but let me say it this way. If it's a logical problem, you deal with it with logic. If it's an emotional problem, you burp the emotion. Just like with a baby, you burp them after they eat, and then you redirect them back to playing with the toys. With these folks, you burp them, and then you send them because it's emotional. You burp emotion, you respond to logic or thoughtfulness. And then give them feedback about how they're coming across to others. Sometimes they don't see that other people are beginning to roll their eyes at them because they haven't had the feedback. These are folks that frequently don't pick on up on social cues, or whose emotional internal pressure and feelings get the best of them. And they do pick up on the cues, but the pressure on the inside is so strong, they end up letting stuff out without a filter. And so as a manager, once we burp them and redirect them, then we just need to give them feedback from time to time that you're irritating other people. So you just need to do your best to keep a cork in it. All right. Characteristics of light eaters. Emotional black holes about change. They don't like change, and they suck up all hope into their black darkness. That's why I say they eat light. If hope is like light, they crush it all. They must convert everyone around them to negativity. Okay, if I'm unhappy at work and you're happy at work, the only thing I can do is to convince you that it's a horrible place or a horrible change or a horrible process so that you hate it too, and that proves that I'm right. But if there are other people that are happy in the midst of the same processes, the same organization that makes me miserable, then maybe the problem is me and not the organization. So rather than work on myself, I'd rather work on everyone else around me, trying to convert them over. And they have disproportionate influence for resistance because they're loud. I like to say it this way. They go grab dust and they throw dust in the air until it gets in everybody's eyes and gets in everybody's hair. And then suddenly people are like, I don't know that I like this place. It's always so dusty. Yeah, because there's 2 dust throwers on the team. Not necessarily the change team, but on the department or in the group that's trying to implement the change. So what do you do with light eaters? Well, it just depends. Easiest thing to do is fire them. And I'm not joking on this. The best method to deal with light eaters is give them to your competitors. But sometimes you can't do that for political reasons. We don't have time today to talk about what happens, unless you want to go over in Q&A. What do you do if one of the bosses, one of the managers, or even the leader is a light eater? Rarely do those folks make it to light eaters unless it's a recent phenomenon. They've had something shift in their life, and now they're horribly negative. Or it's a privately held company, and it, frankly, is a family member. And then those are the only 2 times you find that, because light eaters are so expensive to an organization. They destroy so much that most for-profit organizations simply can't have them as a leader. So it's a rare situation. It does happen, but it's rare. So first, you fire them. Secondly, you run the trap play. The trap play is where you don't have the political chips to deal with them, but you quit protecting the group from them so that the group deals with them. And let me give you an example. I was working with an organization, and there was a woman who was a bully. She would physically and vocally intimidate people. And that was just her style. And she had a very soft, introverted, kind, somewhat passive leader. And even the vice president was a scientist and not and not really tough. He was a lover, not a fighter, and a lover of science to boot. So he didn't spend a lot of time managing, and as a result, this woman ran rampant. And so when I facilitated this situation, I let her talk. And people would come up to break and say, she does this, and she's got to be stopped. Okay, why don't you stop her? Oh, because she will turn on you. I said, I get it. So I finally I let her go. I didn't. People are like, you've got to control her. You're an outsider. We're paying you to have a good meeting. I said, well, I am. I'm simply letting her out. She's so contained, we need to let her out. They said, no. I said, yeah, if we let her out, then it will be obvious. She will not be able to stop herself, and she will begin to say things that make it obvious this has to be dealt with. But you all hold her back enough that it just keeps limping along like this. And so finally, people in the group said to her, you have to stop. And then it worked its way up to the VP and to senior HR, and after 5 years, they finally dealt with her. And then lastly, you can cellophane them. Sometimes you can't do the trap play because they're a protected species. For whatever reason, it would be difficult, expensive, or a lawsuit for the organization to deal with them. And in those cases, you cellophane them into a corner. And you poke a hole, they get a straw, they breathe through a straw, so you don't kill them, but you just kind of keep them alive and isolate them. And you do that by having the team say, enough's enough. And it takes a little skill and finesse to do that. And I wish we could go into more detail on kind of step by step what to do with that. But you cellophane them into a corner and you show them respect and dignity. Often the respect and dignity they don't show to other people. And then you you allow the group to distance themselves from the person so they quit having undue influence. All right. Of the three, one more poll, and then we'll wrap up. Of the three types of negative people, who do you find the most challenging to deal with? Take a moment.
All right, we've got about 50% voted so far, so we'll give it a few more seconds to allow more folks to participate. All right, we're at 80% now, so I will close the poll and share the results.
Look at that. I think that is typical results that people find all three of the types of negative reactions to be challenging to deal with. So thank you for thank you for taking the time to do the poll. I think it's very instructive and frankly typical, because one of the most helpful parts of this approach is simply to, I popped too fast. Well, I think one of the most helpful parts of this approach is simply to delineate the three types of negative reactions, because many of us who are not in those on the negative side of the spectrum, many of us lump them all into one big bucket of negativity, and knowing that there are three different negative responses and that there are ways of dealing with each of the three of those has helped so many leaders of change through the years go, oh, I'm treating them all the same, and frankly, I'm often ignoring them because I don't know what to do with them. And just delineating them allows us to disperse the resistance by giving each of them what they need. All right? Questions?
All right. Thanks, Hayden. Those are great. Actually, I had a question for you just on that last point you made. How often, then, do you think we tend to bucket the negative responses as just emotional? Because it's contrary to what we're trying to push.
I think it's probably more so with your members, because many of your members are logical by nature. I mean, I know I'm overgeneralizing, but the kind of folks that get excited about measurement and get excited about process redesign and get excited about quality, those folks often have a more analytic side to the way their brain works, to the way their neural pathways run. And so, if you're a logical person who believes it's a good thing, and you see logical people, analytical people, you see people who are resistant to it, it's easy to bucket them all into a category of emotional when they're, in many cases, just preservationists.
Right. Okay, thank you. We do have some questions coming in. The first question we have is probably one we should have expected, which is, what do you mean by burp, and can you kind of put some clarity around how that occurs?
You bet. So, if a person comes to you with emotion, instead of trying to have a logical conversation with them around the emotion, and let me give an example. You know, people are going to, let's take one of the more extreme things that get said in the middle of change processes. People are going to lose their jobs. That's what happens in every system realignment. We get new processes, new systems. People get fired. They get let go. Is this person giving logical facts, or are they emotionally reacting? Well, if they're coming at you logically, you say, well, what's the basis for that? Where are you getting that data? And well, that's what I've been hearing. Oh, well, here's what I've been hearing. Here's what's in the plan. And you can respond with facts. Now, they may not believe you, but you can respond with facts. If, on the other hand, you can recognize that they're coming at this emotionally, dealing with facts only provokes the emotion. So burping would be like this. Well, you know, I would be concerned too if people were going to lose their job. I would be concerned about my job as well as everyone else. And so I can tell that you're really worried about that. Well, I don't know that I'm really worried about that, but I just remember 10 years ago. What happened 10 years ago? I wasn't here then. And you get them talking about their feelings rather than responding with facts. And so if you wanted to learn more about the burping process, it often goes by the name empathic listening or feeling listening. And you can often find it in emotional intelligence, or Stephen Covey in the 7 Habits probably is the most famous person for teaching how to do empathic listening. And so give a shout out to him, because I've worked with him for 25 years. And you let them process their emotion, and then they're like, I'm worried about my job because I got these kids in college, and then I got a kid in my basement who's halfway through his degree, and I don't know what to do about that. And you're like, I do have a job to do here. So you let them run a little bit because it's emotional, and you're burping, and then you say, wow, I can see that this is a real worry for you. I just want to thank you for all the hard work you're doing, and as far as I can tell, this change process isn't going to impact the things you're worried about, but doesn't mean they're not real worries when you got kids in college. And you're not talking about facts, you're talking about them and their emotions. Hey, thanks for all that you're doing, and you just redirect them back into work. What do you think the most important thing that you could help with to make this change happen? And you redirect them back to their job or back to their next step in the change process. Thanks for asking that question. That's a great one. And how do you go, what it looks like under live ammunition.
So it sounds like it's more like an empathy and an acknowledgement tactic. Would you think personally, I know people who try to empathize tend to occasionally sympathize, which is a slightly different approach as far as that goes. Would you consider the sympathy angle probably a little bit more dangerous with those people?
Well, it is a little harder to sympathize. Oh, I know. That's my biggest fear of being on this team, is that installing this process means that we could eliminate 7% of the jobs of people I really enjoy working with. I do believe that you just need to go in and tell your boss, I have to resign because I just blew up my change process and my own credibility. So that would be sympathizing. And
right.
Empathizing is, you know what? If I had 2 kids in college, I'd be worried too. You are empathizing with them without sympathizing with them. And I think the distinction in the Greek is really clear. Sin means with, whereas M means into. In sympathy, we have the same thing. In empathy, we imagine what it's like, and we enter into their experience.
Right. Okay. Thank you. We got another question about the preservationists. When it says that preservationists are especially challenged are those who have vested interest around maintaining the status quo because the system, process, tool, they feel threatened by any change or questioning of that. I know one of the things in change research we've seen is that middle management barrier, because these are people who've been invested in the status quo and they've made their career out of it. Do you have any advice about handling that type of preservationist?
I do. You're going to like a 301 level with this, and so that's beautiful. Because within the preservationists, there are different motivations for preserving the past. And all of us, no matter how objective we are thoughtful about those, all of us are also self-preservationists. And so I'm a self-preservationist in that I have a new admin who had some ideas about how we could do things differently with one of my tracking processes. And here's what I said to her. I spent 15 hours researching it and designing it. I built this myself. And so I am open theoretically to new ideas, but I want you to know I'm not that open to it because I worked really hard on this, and I'm going to have to be really convinced. So I was just up front with my resistance to her. I'm a preservationist on this one. I want to be logical, but I admit that I'm not, because this was my baby. And anybody that does process redesign or begins to measure quality systems and then it impacts somebody in production and they're like, I've been working on this for 10 years and you're telling me it's not meeting standards or there's a better way to do it. There's an emotional, they become kind of an instant resistor. They move over from a progressive to a resistor, and they don't even realize it because they've got that buy-in. I can be a preservationist if I've got a long neural pathway. I've been doing it the same way with success for the last 10 years. I just don't want to do it differently. And so if we can identify what it is that's causing it, sometimes people are straddling. They're being thoughtful in their responses, but the root of it is emotional, so they're really a resistor.
Thank you. One of the questions we had is, how do you understand what risks that the preservationists bring forward are worth addressing in the plan and which ones aren't?
This is where preservationists actually create more work than enthusiasts have any patience for. And this is where enthusiasts begin peeling off like either the fuselage or the tiles on the space shuttle, right? That becomes the challenge, because when a group of people working on the change gets slowed down by asking for feedback from a preservationist, or hearing what the fence setters are hearing, and then they have to go dig in and research some of the thoughtful things to validate risk. And and you all have tools. APQC has tools on how do you evaluate risk, and literally tools to go through the planning process of risk evaluation. And I would recommend those tools or similar tools, but that takes extra time. And so the enthusiasts particularly get so crazy when you have to slow down and go research that stuff. But that really is what makes a change process work for the more negative, more resistant half, is that you've taken the time to sort where the risks are and to mitigate those risks. It's good project management, but it's also good change management for the folks that can't believe it until they see it. They need to know that we've taken the details seriously.
Right. Thank you. One of the questions, I think we probably have time for maybe one or two more questions. One of them is, management always wants change to happen fast. However, this seems like a very methodical approach. Approximately how long does this kind of wave using this approach take?
That's a great question, and I hate when people say that. I don't know why I just did that. You're right. All the other questions that came before are no good, but this one was great. It is an insightful question, because I think the easiest way to answer that is the change process emotionally takes however long the change process emotionally takes. So you can install change in about 6 months, even in a big change process, but you're still dealing with emotions of that change 9 to 18 months later. I remember reading Tom Peters in Search of Excellence, and his talking about having to poke through the 18-month barrier that, like the wall that comes up in a marathon, big change process, and he was using quality as an example. Installing quality hits a barrier around 18 months where people are just fatigued by it, and having to punch through that barrier. And so you bet we can often install things, and leaders are on to the next thing. But the change emotionally takes the time the change takes. And often leaders find themselves with change projects that are stalled out because it's an emotional thing. And so what do you do about it? Let me ask myself a question. What do you do about that? I think understanding that for leaders, they are so bored out of their head with it is the big insight. If you're a manager or a VP, you have been talking about the change for 6 months before it got implemented. And so 6 months into the change, you're at a year point. You are so tired of talking about it, you can't even bear to hear the words, just like fingernails on blackboard. And then Hayden comes along and says, well, now it's time to start dealing with emotions. You're like, no, I am done. I declare this change over. Well, then it all goes underground, and now you've got a tsunami. And a year later, they're doing some kind of engagement survey in your organization, and the engagement's down by 15%. People are like, I don't know what we're going to do. We better buy donuts and bring in some training. Get some clowns and balloons. No, we just sit underground the tsunami, and it came out on the survey. Bottom line is, the human beings take however long human beings take, and if we can acknowledge this, we can build this in up front, and we can be running 4 different changes at the same time, but dealing with the emotions of them in different stages of the wave. Oop, I see it's 1. I must stop.
Right. Okay. I was going to say, thank you. It sounds like this is linking back into kind of the whole purpose of why we have the conversation, and we are out of time. So, Sarah, do you want to wrap us up?
Sure thing. Thanks, Holly, and thank you, Hayden, for that presentation. As Holly said at the beginning, always entertaining, so we appreciate you coming on with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. And as a reminder to everyone on the call, we will be sending out an email with a copy of today's slides and a recording of the webinar itself within the next few days. So other than that, thanks again, Hayden. Thank you, Holly, for your moderation expertise. Please fill out the survey that you are prompted with when you exit the webinar so we can continuously improve our sessions here. And everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. See you next month.
Thank you.